Welcome to session 19 of our class on the Conquest. We're in 1 Samuel chapter 31. The event to which the last chapters have been leading, the death of Saul, comes swiftly now. The account is brief and factual, and the more moving because of that. The Philistines had fought against Israel back in the beginning of Saul's reign, 1 Samuel 13, and even earlier than that in 1 Samuel 4. But now they fight Israel again. Saul's divine commission had been to save Israel from the Philistines, 1 Samuel chapter 9. But ironically, he dies at their hand. And such is the measure of his failure. The sons of Saul are the first named casualties in verses 2 through 7. But Saul is also much sought after and is wounded by the archers, though not killed outright. David, who had once been Saul's armor bearer, would have approved of the one who refused to run his sword through the king out of awe for the person of the Lord's anointed. Saul heroically fell upon his own sword rather than have the uncircumcised Philistines make sport of him. There was no telling what indignity they might inflict on him, so death was preferable to capture. The armor bearer chose to die with his master and all his men, the chosen troops with whom he surrounded himself. Troop movements could be seen from the other side of the valley, from the hill of Moreh and the hills on the north side of the valley of Jezreel, as well as from vantage points east of Jordan. The bad news caused a mass evacuation from Israelite towns in the region, so therefore leaving them open to Philistine occupation. In verses 8 through 10, though Saul did not live to witness the scene, the Philistines did enjoy themselves at his expense. In particular, they made capital out of their victory by congratulating their gods and by dedicating Saul's armor to become a trophy in the temple of Ashtaroth, in much the same way as Goliath's sword had been treasured in Israel's sanctuary, 1 Samuel chapter 21. The foreign deity had triumphed, supposedly, and the decapitated body of Israel's anointed king was hung, exposed, on the city of the wall of Bethshan, the easternmost of the line of old Canaanite fortress cities across the country, from the Mediterranean to the Jordan, which the Israelites had not conquered. In verses 11 through 13, the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead, remembering their debt to Saul, who had rallied the men of Israel and come to their aid when they were intimidated by Nahash the Ammonite in 1 Samuel 11, these men took the opportunity to demonstrate their continuing loyalty to Saul. They removed the impaled bodies of Saul and his sons, risking their lives in so doing, and took them back to Jabesh and burnt them there. Eventually, the remains, which would have been the bones of Saul and his sons, were removed to the family tomb in 2 Samuel 21. There was some consolation for Israel, therefore, in the circumstances of Saul's death. Though the Philistines became the victors, they were deprived of the satisfaction of torturing and deriding Israel's king. He died an honorable death, at least in the way that he died, and his burial recalled his heroic leadership against Philistine aggression in his early days as king, when he had rescued the oppressed and had won the allegiance of all the people. But there's no denying that between the initial victory at Jabesh Gilead and his burial there, Saul had lived a tragic life. He had had so much going for him. His height gave him a commanding presence. He had been chosen by sacred lot and designated by a prophet of the Lord, and he had won popular acclaim by his valor in avenging wrong. Israel recognized moral worth and appreciated those leaders who cared about the oppressed, as Saul had so manifestly done. The evidence suggests that Saul had a brooding temperament and was given to melancholy. It was easy for him to retreat from the limelight and become intensely jealous of a rival. But was his inherited temperament part of his fate? It was a potent factor in Saul's life, but the texts indicate that Saul was responsible for his deliberate, stubborn refusal to admit when he had done wrong and humble himself in repentance. This stubborn streak in Saul brought about a rift in relationship with Samuel, which left the king without the spiritual support that he needed, and this increased his isolation, his depression, and his fits of mania. Saul calls forth our sympathy because his human frailty reminds us of our own. But his failure was not inevitable. He was responsible for his rejection of instructions from the one who had appointed him king, and he paid the penalty. Though in the eyes of many modern writers, Saul appears to have been painted worse than he really was, there can scarcely be a more dangerous plight than to be found in opposition to God. This was where Saul's disobedience landed him. He may have been more upright than David in terms of human standards of social behavior, but the biblical writers judge first and foremost in terms of the first commandment. As a man is in the presence of his God, so is he. By that test, Saul stood condemned. This brings us to 2 Samuel, and this is where we find David rising to power. In the first chapter, in the first 16 verses, David receives news of Saul's death. You know, David's fortunes at a low ebb since he had been forced to take refuge with the Philistines years earlier. His fortunes had been only slightly improved by the successful battle against the Amalekites. He and his men were still recovering from the battle, and they still needed to restore their charred homes when, on the third day back, they received news of the battle against the Philistines. The messenger announced beforehand by his appearance that he was the bearer of bad news, because torn garments and hair caked with dirt were signs of mourning. By falling to the ground before David, he implies that he recognizes the new king, and he expects a reward for his service in running to Ziklag with the latest news from Israel's camp. A general retreat, the death of many, including Saul and Jonathan, summarized the situation. But David wanted some verification concerning the death of the king and his son. At this request, the messenger, elaborating the story to ingratiate himself with David, as he thinks, he misjudges the reaction of the one he wants to impress. The reader knows that his story does not tally with the events already recorded. Saul had not needed assistance in dying by his own hand. It was ironic that David had only just returned from fighting the Amalekites, and here was an Amalekite daring to admit that he had slain the king. In proof, he produced the distinctive regalia of the king, his crown, which identified him even in battle, and his armlet, a royal bracelet worn on the upper arm. Far from rejoicing, David and his army plunged into mourning at the news that they had received, expressing their grief at the disaster that had befallen the people of the Lord. Though forced out of Israel, David and his men still regarded themselves as part of the house of Israel, and there was no longer any need to make a pretense of having deserted to the Philistines. The messenger repeated that he was an Amalekite, but resident in Israel. His father may have joined the household of a citizen of Israel working for him on the farm. It is not clear where he fought for Israel, or whether he did or not. Expecting now to receive a handsome reward for having served David's interest, the messenger was instead called to account for having presumed to kill the Lord's anointed. As a resident, he could hardly plead ignorance of the awe that surrounded the person of the king in Israel, and David regarded him as deserving death. And surely he would have known that David had studiously avoided putting Saul to death on the grounds that he was the Lord's anointed. The death of the Amalekite would be accepted as just by Israelites generally, even if he had fabricated his killing of Saul. The man was condemned by his own mouth, and David would be cleared of possible suspicion of having rejoiced in the death of Saul. The phrase, "your blood be upon your head," means the blood you have shed is the cause of your own death. The themes of verse 1 recur in inverse order in verse 16. And David's slaughter of the Amalekites was completed by the judicial death of this one Amalekite. Whereas Saul had incurred his rejection through not exterminating the Amalekites, David has now triumphed over this persistent enemy and has vindicated the right by punishing sacrilege, for to kill the anointed of the Lord was to turn against the Lord himself. This was David's deep conviction and should not be regarded as a cloak for political intentions. All the same, David's action was observed, remembered, and recorded, and it had a bearing on his reputation, as it did on his acceptance as Israel's king, but that was incidental. David's motive in sparing Saul had been reverence for the one whom the Lord had chosen and anointed. Neither he nor any other human being had the right to end the life of the anointed of the Lord. Now we come to verses 17 through 27 and David's lament over Saul and his sons, or Saul and Jonathan specifically. With this poetic outpouring of his distress, David's Philistine period is brought to a conclusion and the way prepared for a new departure and a new phase in David's life. David lamented in verses 17 through 27, whereas in verses 11 and 12 all the crowd lamented together. Now David uses all his creative ability to express the overwhelming agony of bereavement, and he does so in a song. Without going through every detail of every verse, we will hit the highlights. Memories of Jonathan and Saul at the height of their powers come flooding back. They had been courageous in battle. Jonathan characteristically with his bow, which suggested perhaps the title of the lament, and Saul with his sword, so that they returned not empty from battle, but brought with them rich spoils. They were accustomed to victory. The two comparisons, swifter than eagles, stronger than lions, evoke the wide open spaces, powerful movement, and formidable strength. Saul and Jonathan had been in a class apart. Thinking specifically of Saul, David can only mourn, and he calls on the daughters of Israel to weep for Saul. How are the mighty fallen, relates to King Saul. Thus the women are to take their share in the lament for the one who fell in the midst of the battle. The gazelle, or as we might say, the jewel of Israel, was Jonathan. David speaks directly to Jonathan now, the one he has wanted to honor from the beginning. And for the first time, the first person verb is used. I am distressed for you. While David had called on others to weep for Saul, David was consumed with grief for his brother Jonathan, whom he addresses as though he were still living. Very pleasant does not express sufficiently strongly what the poet is saying here. Very dear captures the emotion with which David remembers Jonathan. Indeed, David had never experienced such love as Jonathan had shown him. He did not need to spell it out, for anyone and everyone knew that Jonathan, the heir to the throne, had not claimed his rights to the throne, but had voluntarily renounced them in favor of David, whom he had protected and encouraged through the years. And this renunciation of his rights had been no impulsive act, but it was an ongoing, generous attitude of heart and mind. Jonathan had allowed his own interest to be disregarded in order that David's interest could prosper. True, that kind of love David had found in the women of his life, his mother and his wives, but even their love was not to be compared with the love which had motivated Jonathan. While Saul had distributed gifts which tended to win him support, Jonathan's selfless, transparent goodness had not even looked for the reward. Therefore, you have David's superlative praise for Jonathan here. Your love to me was wonderful, passing the love even of women. Contrary to what some might have us to believe, this phrase and the relationship of Jonathan and David does not have anything to do with homosexual love. David has spoken to Jonathan, but now he must face reality. Jonathan is among the mighty fallen. The battle is over, and the weapons of war have perished. For all David knows, these two great men are still lying untended on the war-torn slopes of Gilboa, their weapons useless beside them, impotent despite their destructive power. The scene is an eloquent and moving statement about human greatness, and it brings to a fitting end David's poignant lament. This, then, is the poem which David wanted all Judah to know by heart, and which was written in the nation's anthology of great events. Indeed, all the great families had a place in this lament, having supplied their own mighty men to fight alongside Saul and Jonathan, and so it became their lament also. As the mourning women wept for their sons and husbands, so they would weep for the king and his son. Such is the power of poetry, that the mountains of Gilboa are well known by name even in the modern world. Yet the name occurs only in connection with Saul's last battle. We too find ourselves caught up in a world of destruction and death, in which David's lament still plays its part in verbalizing the grief which can never find adequate expression. The lament brings to an end the account of Saul's reign, but at the same time it marks the beginning of the reign of David. This brings us to chapter 2 of 2 Samuel. The death of Saul was the signal for David's departure from Ziklag and Philistine vassaldom, but the best way to proceed was far from obvious. Saul had left sons and men of power over his army who were capable of asserting their authority, and who had the backing of those who had supported Saul. In particular, they could count on the loyalty of Saul's tribe, Benjamin. The Philistines had their outposts as far north and east as Bethshan, and had established their military hold over Israel, driving a wedge between the northernmost tribes and the central area of Ephraim and Benjamin. Israel's territory east of Jordan was more or less intact, but the general picture was one of fragmentation and uncertainty in the absence of one commanding figure to establish a lead and unite the country. So the first thing David does is inquire of the Lord. Without doubt, he had a possible course of action in mind, but unlike Saul, he was not relying on his own judgment alone. There were good reasons for him to move into the territory of Judah, It was geographically close at hand. It was the tribe to which he belonged, and he had had some recent contact with his friends, the elders of Judah, in 1 Samuel chapter 30, who might be expected to welcome his approaches. When he consulted the priest Abiathar, who had the ephod, the Lord's answer through the sacred lot confirmed that David should proceed to Judah, and when the cities of Judah were named, it was Hebron that received the affirmative answer. David's arrival was the signal for the men of Judah to anoint him king over the house of Judah. Years before, Samuel had anointed David without disclosing the significance of his action. Now, in a public ceremony, the divine intention was beginning to be fulfilled, but the event is referred to almost in passing. There is much still to be accomplished. David, concerned to know whether Saul and his sons had been given a decent burial, received the information that the people of Jabesh Gilead had rescued their bodies and had given them honorable burial. David took it upon himself to express appreciation of their loyalty and to assure them that it would not go unrewarded, either by the Lord or by himself. The phrase, "I will do good to you," implies that he will soon be in control, and virtually invites this city, strategically placed on the east side of the Jordan, some 80 miles to the north of Hebron. He invites them to give him its allegiance, as the people of Hebron have done. Though no reply is recorded, his diplomatic approach will have been appreciated and remembered. Now, the reason why the city of Jabesh Gilead was in no position to give active support to David becomes apparent in chapter 2, verse 8 and following. It already had a king. Abner, cousin of Saul and captain of his army, took the initiative in establishing as successor to Saul his son Ishbosheth, a survivor of the battle in which his 3 older brothers had lost their lives. The account clearly conveys Abner as the power behind the king. Ishbosheth, who was younger than Jonathan, was 40 years old when he began to reign, whereas David was 30, according to 2 Samuel 5 and verse 4. Stalemate between the opposing claimants to the throne was broken by Abner, who went out on a military exploit to the ancient city of Gibeon, close to Geba, from which Saul came. The pool of Gibeon was so famous that no explanation was needed. Even today there are 2 water systems to be seen which from the Iron Age onwards provided access to spring water during time of siege. One of these, a cylindrical hole in the rock about 37 feet in diameter and over twice as deep, led by means of a staircase cut round the side of the pit and down into the rock below to a spring, which evidently at times filled the big hole almost to the top. This, or the spring below, may have been the pool referred to. What started as a competitive skirmish ended as a battle to the death in verses 14 through 17. With 12 men on each side, some kind of contest was agreed upon, but swords were drawn and fatal wounds inflicted. It was not the kind of fight of which David would have approved. The death of the young warriors caused the tournament to escalate into a full-scale battle, which ended in favor of David's men. In verses 18 through 23, the 3 sons of David's sister Zeruiah made it their aim to follow up the victory by eliminating Abner and so enabling David to become king of the whole of Saul's territory. Asahel, the youngest, was noted for his speed as a runner. He was swift as a wild gazelle. Abner, the experienced warrior, knew his opponents well, and he had no wish to kill Joab's brother, but was forced to do so in self-defense by the younger man's persistence. Abner suddenly stopped and pointed his spear behind him. Asahel could not prevent himself from running onto the spear, which pierced him through. He died instantly. His valiant exploit on David's behalf was so much appreciated that travelers coming to the spot stood still as a mark of respect. In the heat of battle, however, Joab and Abishai continued the pursuit after Abner, whose eastward route required a valley to take him towards the Jordan. On a hill in that inhospitable country, Abner was able to rally his men behind him and confront his pursuers. His aim was to achieve some respite, hence his appeal to Joab to call off the chase. Joab implies that his men could still have plenty of strength in reserve, but reluctantly, in response to a special request, Joab blew the trumpet, so signaling the end of the episode for the time being. Abner's men took the remainder of the night and half the next day to reach Machanaim. The aftermath of the battle is recorded by David's supporters, who set their loss of 20 men in all against a much larger number in Abner's ranks. 360 dead implies an army of several hundreds, much larger than the account had led us to expect. Picking up Asahel's body on the return journey, they buried it in his family tomb at Bethlehem in accordance with custom. The account is well authenticated by this and other local traditions and names, and by the memory that the day broke upon them at Hebron. Indeed, the vivid detail suggests that it is the work of an eyewitness who sees the significance for the future of the superiority of David's troops. It was a trend that continued, and a sign to those who believed of the unseen working of God's hand in history. In chapter 3, verses 2 through 5, we have a listing of David's sons. Already during David's reign at Hebron, he had children who would qualify as heirs to his throne. Sons born later in Jerusalem are listed in 2 Samuel 5. Michal does not feature because she bore no children. David's firstborn is Amnon, whose death is recorded at the hand of the third in line of succession, Absalom, who was born to the daughter of a northern king. Between them came Chileab, who in 1 Chronicles 3 is called Daniel. Nothing more is said about him, and he disappears from the scene. Adonijah made a bid for the throne when his father was dying in 1 Kings 1. Simply on the grounds of seniority, he had a claim. David was ensuring that even at his early age, he would have a son to succeed him as a king, and his household of 6 wives was a sign of prestige, even though it must not have been pleasing to God. Ishbosheth was aware that Abner was growing powerful at his expense, and he found occasion to challenge him when Abner supposedly helped himself to Rizpah, the concubine of Saul, whose sons were Mephibosheth and Armoni. To take the wife or concubine of the late monarch was to appropriate his property and to make a bid for the throne. In verses 8 through 11 of chapter 3, the anger of Abner at the accusation indicates his powerful position. The phrase, "a dog's head of Judah," means a contemptible running dog of Judah. After all he has done for Ishbosheth, Abner takes offense that his conduct should be questioned. He implies that Ishbosheth owes everything to Abner's loyalty, as indeed he probably did. By way of retaliation, Abner will transfer his allegiance from the house of Saul to that of David, so accomplishing what the Lord has sworn to him. The word of Samuel to David, though spoken in private family gathering and unrecorded except as Samuel's instruction from the Lord, had become widely known. Now even Abner, who had willingly flouted what he knew to be God's revealed purpose, finds himself helping to fulfill it. He knows that in the near future David will unite the kingdoms of Israel and Judah from Dan to Beersheba, the northern and southern extremities of the Promised Land. Without the support of Abner, Ishbosheth becomes merely a puppet, powerless to oppose his general. In verses 12 through 16, David was not caught off guard by the messengers Abner sent to him. He was being invited to enter into a covenant with a man who was betraying his master, and who claimed to have the power to bring over all Israel to David. Such a ruthless leader threatened to be a rival to David in future. For this reason, David had his condition ready. Bring first Michal, Saul's daughter. He had fought for her in 1 Samuel 18. She had been given to him in marriage, and though she had been given to another man, he had the right to demand her return. It was a shrewd political move, because the presence of Saul's daughter as his wife would give to David a strong claim to the throne of Saul, while a son would unite the two houses. But it was also a bold move to approach the reigning king direct with such a request. David had read the situation aright. He was not rebuffed. Ishbosheth complied and arranged for Michal to be escorted to David. No sympathy was permitted for Michal, nor for her stricken husband. Affairs of state had to take precedence over personal feelings. In verses 17 through 19, Abner fulfilled David's condition by seeing to it that Michal went on to join David, but Abner himself convened a conference of elders representing the northern tribes. Benjamin, sandwiched between north and south, he consulted separately on his way south to Hebron, for Saul's own tribe needed specially sensitive handling. Abner's assertion that there had been a general demand for David's kingship may simply have been an example of his strategy in public relations. His suggestion made compliance the obvious next step, while his quotation of the Lord's promise, made originally concerning Saul, gave religious authority to Abner's proposal. This divine pronouncement concerning David is not recorded apart from Abner's use of it. Having obtained a unanimous agreement, Abner was ready to return to David. Well, David receives the delegation under Abner's leadership with royal hospitality, and was all prepared to become king of the northern tribes when Abner returned with their representatives to Hebron. Mutual trust and respect between David and Abner was growing, so that he left in peace and safety. In chapter 3, verses 22 to 39, we read of the death of Abner. The arrival of the servants of David with Joab when Abner's visit was still the latest news introduced a protest group that had to be reckoned with. Courtiers who were uneasy at David's new alliance knew they would find a champion in Joab. There were two good reasons. Abner had killed Joab's brother Asahel, albeit unwillingly and in self-defense. And in addition, Joab would have recognized in Abner a rival for high office in David's court. Full of indignation, he rushed into the king's presence and criticized the policy David had adopted, accusing him of naivety in trusting the motives of a supposed enemy. The fact that no response is recorded may indicate that David was having second thoughts, which caused him to be influenced by Joab's strong assertions. But Joab was exceeding his office in taking it upon himself to counter the decisions of the king and frustrate his intentions. To do so was virtually to assume royal power, and a lesser man than David would have dealt accordingly with Joab. Perhaps afterwards he wished he had punished Joab, as we see that he does in 1 Kings chapter 2. In verses 26 through 30, the text specifically says that David did not know about Joab's messengers who were sent to fetch Abner back from the cistern of Sirah. Joab acted with all speed. He met Abner at the gate of Hebron and treacherously killed him in cold blood for the blood of Asahel his brother. Joab would probably have justified his action on the grounds of the ancient system of family obligations, as recorded in Numbers chapter 35. The avenger of blood had to see that the murderer was himself put to death, and Abner was aware of the possible implications of his deed, according to 2 Samuel 2:22. But Asahel had been put to death in the aftermath of war, and it is questionable whether in such a case the avenger of blood had any such obligation. David indeed implies that Joab and Abishai his brother, who is later implicated in verse 30, that they were both guilty of shedding the blood of Abner without cause, while David declared himself guiltless before the Lord, which was an expression that David would not use lightly. The curse for which he calls to be on the house of Joab, as well as on Joab himself, is frightening. One who has a discharge would be perpetually unclean and therefore barred from worship, according to Leviticus 15. One who holds a spindle implies a disability that required a sedentary occupation. These 5 afflictions that are named would be signs of the Lord's righteous judgment on Joab's action, and future generations would note how the curse was fulfilled. David put Joab in his place in verses 31 to 39 by ordering him to take part in the funeral for Abner. Since he was the cause of the death, it was out of keeping that he should wear sackcloth as though he grieved for the loss of this man. The anomaly would not be missed by the crowds, who would see that David had not condoned the action of his general. David's desire to honor the memory of Abner was displayed by his place as first mourner in the funeral procession, by the fact that he led the expressions of grief, and by the poem that he composed for the occasion. In this lament, David displays once more his originality as a poet. In the brief compass of 4 lines, he captures the feelings of this untimely death. Should Abner die as a fool dies? The great man with so much potential had died like a fool in the sense that the Bible uses the word. He had died like a rebel against God and his law, hence the lawless that is found in the NIV. He had been put to death like a criminal, yet he was nothing of the sort. Addressing him directly, David declared Abner's freedom from handcuffs and chains, a free man, as he fell as one who falls before the wicked, a direct reference to Joab, yet refraining from calling him a murderer. David said just enough to convey his own regret at what had happened and to express the public grief, without incriminating anyone else in a capital crime. David was careful to match his words by his deeds. He would not eat at the funeral feast when he was in mourning, and the king's abstinence pleased all the people, who appreciated this sign of genuine feeling in their leader. Indeed, all Israel got the message that the death of Abner had not been the king's will. If there had been any hint that Joab had acted with David's connivance, even David would not have escaped the condemnation of a watchful nation. All the same, David left nothing to chance, and the words of the king to his servants were no doubt meant for mass consumption and quotation. Do you not know that a prince and a great man has fallen this day in Israel? Moreover, David found himself weak in the sense that he could not accomplish what he wanted to do because his plans were thwarted by Joab and his brother. The task of keeping within bounds these headstrong soldiers was one of David's recurring difficulties, and his complaint, "The sons of Zeruiah are too hard for me," becomes almost a refrain, occurring several more times in the text. Remember, the sons of Zeruiah are David's nephews. These relatives of his took too much upon themselves, acting without the king's authorization and against his wishes. As he had done in respect of Saul, David looked to the Lord to work out his justice in the matter. He felt sufficiently secure in his throne not to take punitive action on his own account. This brings us to chapter 4 of 2 Samuel. This is where we read of the downfall of Saul's house. The death of Abner was the turning point, not only for Ishbosheth, but also for Israel as a whole. There was nothing to stop ruthless men taking advantage of the power vacuum and asserting their own self-assigned authority. In this connection, we are introduced to Baanah and to Rechab, experienced soldiers, and as Benjamites, trusted supporters of Ishbosheth. Ishbosheth appears to have had no suspicion that he might have traitors among his troops. The easy access these two men had to the person of the king is astonishing. Even an ordinary household could be expected to be more security conscious, especially during the afternoon rest hour. They went into the inner part of the house as if to get some wheat, and they stabbed him. The motive for the murder is obscure, unless it was to curry favor with David, who was clearly going to be king of all Israel. The two men hurried to carry their trophy, Ishbosheth's head, to David at Hebron. Their claim, "The Lord has avenged my lord the king," was presuming on God's approval of their deed, as though they had acted on the Lord's express orders. However, they had completely misread the policy of David, who immediately disowned them. His opening words, "As the Lord lives," assert not only his commitment to the Lord, but also his faith in the Lord's direct involvement in the outcome of daily events. David implicitly rejects the hypocrisy of Rechab and Baanah in claiming to be the Lord's executioners. He testifies that the Lord has redeemed his life out of every adversity, for David had not taken the initiative to rid himself of Saul, and he had not permitted others to do so. If these two were after a reward, they should know that David rewarded with death the one who carried the news that Saul was dead, and their cold-blooded murder deserved at least the same sentence. Ishbosheth he describes as a righteous man, for though he was Saul's son, he was not personally involved in his father's guilt, and had done nothing to deserve death. The two men are punished by death, mutilation, and public exposure as a warning to others. The head of Ishbosheth is given a suitable burial in the grave of his general, Abner. The murder of Ishbosheth is a further example of the interference of opportunists who prevented David from pursuing to the end the policy on which he had set his heart. Yet the outcome was to make possible the extension of David's kingdom to all Israel. Evidently, David was cleared of any suspicion in connection with the death of Ishbosheth, and in the absence of any suitable survivor of the house of Saul, David was the obvious choice for king. This brings us to chapter 5, and we find that David becomes king over all Israel in this chapter and the following chapters. In verses 1 through 5, we read of David's covenant with Israel. Abner had already prepared the way for the elders of the northern tribes, including Benjamin, to make David their king. Though Abner did not live to see the ceremony, the representatives of the tribes of Israel appear to have lost no time in assembling at Hebron to swear allegiance to David. They explain their decision on 3 counts. Number 1, the ties of kinship are strong. Number 2, David has already proved himself as a military leader under Saul, and on his own account, when Saul was after his blood. And number 3, most impressive of all, he had divine approval. Now he had won the confidence of the people, and the providential sequence of events which led up to this occasion confirmed the prophetic oracle, which, though not previously recorded in the book, seems to have been widely known. The phrase next is, "You shall be shepherd of my people," or "You will shepherd my people." The symbol of the shepherd, to represent the duties of a ruler, was widely used in the ancient Near East. In the Old Testament, the word shepherd describes the Lord's care of his people in the early poetry of Genesis 49, as well as in the Psalms. The consciousness that the Lord was the shepherd of Israel meant that Israel's human shepherds had before them the highest model of faithfulness, justice, and loving kindness. By their exercise of these qualities, they were judged. Next, we see that they anointed David king over Israel. The event is soon over and even more quickly recounted, but it marked the end of a long, patient wait for God's time and the start of a life work to which David had been appointed in private many years earlier. Now, the public anointing sets him apart as the Lord's anointed, chosen and equipped by the calling and gifts of the Lord God himself to be king over the whole people of Israel. The breakdown of the two parts of his reign shows that the writer intended the 40-year figure to be taken literally. He has not previously mentioned Jerusalem, but takes this opportunity of recording another far-reaching move on David's part, the capture of this particular strategic city, which thus far had remained independent. And the taking of this city is found in verses 6 through 16. The Jebusites were one of the minority peoples of Canaan, frequently mentioned in connection with Jerusalem, which was also known as Jebus. The Jebusite defenders of the city considered their city impregnable, saying, "You will not come in here." The wedge-shaped site consisted of a ridge rising towards the north, with a slope on the west towards the Tyropoean Valley, and an even steeper and longer slope down on the eastern side to the Kidron. A city wall of heavy stones protected the citadel, and from the top stones could easily be rained down on attackers, even by the blind and the lame. As we might say, it was child's play to defend the city. Well, David took the stronghold of Zion against all the odds, and in view of the fact that he had masterminded the operation, it was appropriate that Jerusalem should have become his property, the city of David. The Jebusite city was a fortified area encircling a citadel, whose water supply was the spring of Gihon, near the base of the eastern slope. Having established the most important fact that David made the city his own, the writer allows himself a brief account of the method by which the stronghold was captured. We are told that they entered the city through the water tunnel. We get a little more information on this from 1 Chronicles chapter 11, verses 4 through 9. Well, ultimately, David's continuing progress was to be attributed not to his undoubted gifts, but to his spiritual resources. The Lord, the God of hosts, was with him. 2 pointers are included to ways in which David would consolidate his hold on his new capital. One concerned foreign relations, and the other sons and heirs. In verses 11 and 12, we read of Hiram, king of Tyre. Tyre, an important part which already at the time of David, an important port which already at the time of David had for centuries been trading in the eastern Mediterranean, made friendly overtures to David, who was beginning to win respect beyond Israel's borders. Tyre was noted for its cedar trees, and the port boasted skilled workers in wood and stone, some of whom were loaned to David. They took a gift of cedar wood and constructed the palace in Jerusalem. Foreign recognition was indeed a new development. David was conscious of the encouragement this offered, but the writer notes that David put it down to the Lord's doing for the sake of his people Israel, not for the sake of David personally. This awareness of the Lord's concern for all his people kept David from exaggerating his own importance and from extravagant policies involving oppressive taxation. If David knew Deuteronomy 17:17, he interpreted it in a way that permitted him to keep a harem in the manner of Oriental monarchs. More concubines and wives, more sons and daughters, concerns the question of the order of inheritance. The first 6 children in that order were listed back in 2 Samuel 3, verses 2 through 5. Of the 11 mentioned here, only 2 reappear later. Surprisingly, the 10th son, Solomon, succeeded as king, while his brother Nathan is named in the genealogy of Joseph. Both were sons of Bathsheba. David twice defeats the Philistines in the next several verses. In verses 17 through 25 of 2 Samuel 5, we read about this. So long as David was king only of Judah, the Philistines were content to tolerate his rule. But when he was proclaimed king of all Israel, he became too powerful to be trusted. Hence, these 2 concerted efforts to divide his territory and to weaken his effectiveness. The importance of these 2 battles was obvious, not only to those who lived through them, but also to the future generations of Israel. Had the Philistines been successful in defeating David at the beginning of his reign over the united tribes, it is doubtful whether he would have been able to command the allegiance which brought him to eminence among the peoples of the region. Isaiah was able to make passing reference to the event and expect it to be immediately meaningful more than 2 centuries later in Isaiah 28:21. For Israel, it must have had all the emotional overtones of the great battles that America remembers of World War II. In verses 17 and 18, we are told that all the Philistines united against David, as they appear to have done against Saul. But this time there is emphasis on their total mobilization. David was an even tougher enemy than Saul had been. In verses 19 and 20, we are told that David inquired of the Lord. He lived by his faith and expected guidance in matters concerning the kingdom which he believed the Lord had given him. To both of his questions, the oracle gave an affirmative answer. He could be assured of victory. The name of the place, Baal Perazim, Lord of the Breakthrough, commemorates the fact that David was able to break through the enemy lines so decisively that it seemed to him as if the Lord had burst through ahead of him like a bursting flood. The power of his God had been demonstrated, decisively controlling events and directing history. In verses 22 through 25, in a second attempt to gain the upper hand over David, the Philistines attacked once more in the same valley. David did not take for granted that his God-given strategy on the previous occasion would succeed a second time, nor did he trust his own expertise, but again asked for guidance. This time, he was not to go to meet the enemy head-on. Instead, he was to make a surprise attack from the rear, which would have the advantage of cutting off the Philistine retreat. The Lord gave help in the victory by a wind that had the sound in the trees of marching troops. David accomplished what Saul had failed to achieve, because David did as the Lord commanded him, and he triumphed once again. The secret of success, obedience, had been an option open to Saul, but Saul had not chosen it. David was, indeed, one of a rare company of people, rare even in the Bible, of whom it could be said that they did as the Lord commanded them. The Philistines made no further attempt to thwart the rise of David. So decisive was this battle that from this time on the Philistines ceased to be a serious threat to Israel, though they continued to cause trouble during the period of the monarchy. This brings us to 2 Samuel chapter 6. One of the themes of the book of Samuel or the books of Samuel, is the history of the Ark of the Covenant, taken captive by the Philistines but returned to Israelite territory when it proved to be embarrassingly powerful to humiliate both them and their God. This was recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 5. Not that the decorated gold box was of itself powerful, but everyone knew that it was the symbol of the presence of the Lord God of all the earth, who had made himself known in a special way to Israel, so that they became his people, and he pledged himself to be their God. It was unthinkable that the ark should remain in obscurity in a private house on the border of the land, and once Jerusalem had become the city of David, the king purposed that Jerusalem should be the city where the Lord was honored and worshipped. By enshrining the ark, the symbol of God's presence there in Jerusalem, David transformed the old Jebusite stronghold into the place where the one God was pleased to make himself known. David's intention was good, but problems arose in carrying it out. As we have said, the Ark of God, which is called by the name, avoids the notion that God is somehow to be located in the ark, and yet retains the distinctive function which the Lord had designed that it should fulfill as the place where he would meet with his people and speak with them. The specific name connected with the ark, the name of the Lord of hosts who sits enthroned on the cherubim, envisages the golden cherubim as the footstool of an invisible throne, high and lifted up. We read about this in Isaiah 6 and verse 1. It also gives the idea of the God of the armies of Israel as supremely worthy of worship, 1 Samuel 17:45. But it is in connection with worship at Shiloh that the name first occurs in the Bible. So the hosts were supremely the angels who surrounded the throne rather than Israel's armies. The fact that these angels did God's bidding meant that they accomplished his will. Hence the more meaningful translation, the name of the Lord Almighty, instead of Lord of Hosts. In verses 3 and 4, we find that they carried the ark of God upon a new cart. They did this, no doubt, with very good intention, but they did it without due concern for the holiness of the ark, which was fitted with rings and poles to indicate that it was to be carried by the poles. So transported, it would not have needed to be steadied or touched. In verses 6 and 7, suddenly the joyous celebration comes to a tragic end at the threshing floor of Nacon. Uzzah, by handling the ark, even though it was a spontaneous action to prevent it falling to the ground, committed sacrilege and was killed by the contact with God's holiness. Insofar as David had decreed how the ark was to be transported, he was responsible for Uzzah's death. But some blame must have attached to Uzzah and Ahio, whose family had for years been in charge of the ark. From David's point of view, the death of Uzzah under these circumstances was not only a tragedy for the family of Abinadab, but also a colossal loss of face for the king. In verses 8 through 11, David, for whom everything had been going so well, reacted with hot anger at the Lord's intervention, recalled in the new name for the threshing floor, Perez Uzzah, which means the Lord's outbreak upon Uzzah. David, in his humiliation, blamed God for the incident and opted out of the task of taking the ark on to Jerusalem, partly because he also was afraid of the Lord. He who had experienced wonderful protection over the years from the Lord his God and had known unusual intimacy with God had to come to terms with the fact that he had overstepped the mark and presumed upon the relationship by failing to observe the regulations laid down to safeguard respect for God's holiness. Though Jesus taught us to call God our Father, he also taught us to pray, "Hallowed be thy name," implying the need to pay careful attention lest privilege becomes presumption. as A.F. Kirkpatrick observes, if such reverence was due to the symbol, that is, the ark, with how much greater reverence should the realities of the Christian covenant be regarded? In verses 12 through 15, news that Obed-Edom had experienced the Lord's blessing caused David to fulfill his intention to bring the ark into Jerusalem. Those who bore the ark implies that this time men carried the ark in the prescribed way, by its poles. But even so, after only 6 paces had been taken, David offered sacrifices. 1 Chronicles 15 adds considerable detail, explaining that this time Levites carried the ark of God upon their shoulders with poles, and indicating that the Levites sacrificed 7 bulls and 7 rams because God helped them. David's sacrifices also will have been part thanksgiving for a good start on the journey and part prayer for its safe completion. At the moment of David's triumph, when the ark had successfully entered Jerusalem, his wife Michal took exception to all this religious excitement and display. Her idea might have been that the king should avoid mixing with the people and should be separate and apart from them. As it was, she despised him for the very qualities that made him great, namely devotion to the Lord and worship. The installation of the ark in Jerusalem was the first momentous achievement of David's reign after the capture of the city. It has been pointed out that no public ceremony took place there to proclaim David king or to enthrone him in Jerusalem. This great festival connected with the arrival of the ark was all the more impressive as the proclamation of the Lord as king in Jerusalem, with David as his appointed prince. Jerusalem was now the city of the Lord of hosts, sanctified by his presence and protected by his power, though not unconditionally, as later generations were to discover. This brings us to 1 Samuel chapter 7, but it's also the end of an hour of lecture. So therefore we will stop here. We'll pick up with 2 Samuel 7 when we return in session 20. If you ever have any questions, or if you ever need to talk to me, please contact me, and I'll be happy to help. Thank you.